Well, it's very difficult when they keep repeating themselves, you know. Sorry, Sandy. Well, if you recall, we were chatting last week um, about our experience on this side of the pond um, with the Tudor experience. That the idea then of these very, very powerful Irish stroke Norman families um, were seen as something of a threat to the monarchy. But the state had been set up, the powers of Westminster, the powers of the crown were set, its face was set towards the development of Protestantism. And that in itself was not just a problem, as Sandy was saying earlier, for the Irish Catholics, but was a hell of a problem as well for the English Catholics, who suffered greatly. And we might see that a little bit later on. So it's just, um, we have, I'm telling a one sided story, and I'm very, very conscious of that. We're telling a story of what our experience on this side of the pond would have been. There definitely was an agenda. It was a very, very naked agenda that you can see in retrospect. And it was a horrifying one for a vast majority of the people on this island in terms of its implications. But just tracing things back a little bit, um, I was kind of looking at the middle specifically of the 17th century, and from our point of view, what was that like? I'm trying to remember. I would have gone through a lot of that in my time in secondary school and a little bit later in college. But the 17th century Ireland was a very, very unstable and a very confusing period. And this was progressively confusing because what actually happened was you have several actors, in a way, on the stage. Um, you had the Old English, which were the former Norman families, and they held on very strongly to their own religion. They had developed a great respect for and understanding and absorbed a lot of the Irish customs and language and became patrons of a number of the great storytellers and the great poets in their houses, in their large houses. So they were one actors. They were very loyal to the English crown, pretty much. There were moments of rebellion because of some sense of being oppressed in themselves. But by and large, they were very loyal. Then you had the Gaelic elite, let's say, the the chieftains, the great families of um, the Irish Gaelic chieftains, and their people who were still quite strong. They hadn't totally gone away. The Battle of Kinsale certainly was a great moment of defeat um, and the departure of some major significant players. But by and large, it was a very interesting development was to come in the middle of the century, of the 17th century. But I mentioned the Gaelic families and the Gaelic people. The would be probably 95% of the population were Gaelic families who were Catholic. Um, there had been some successful plantations during the Elizabethan time, particularly. Um, so they too, the people that had come and established their own land holdings, um, were becoming significant enough in population, maybe about 2% of the population. Um, as some of the colonizing and plantations were developing and becoming more successful. You also had those Catholic families in England and in Scotland who were very loyal to a Catholic king, or a Catholic King James, who had promised that he would look after and maintain the Protestant religion and not undermine it. But there was this tremendous loyalty, and they actually at various times would have come over and had an alliance with the powers that be, the major Catholic groupings in Ireland. So what I'm really trying to get at really here is that during the century, there was this diminishing experience of power and freedom for Gaelic society, and its well-being was hugely impacted by English and British politics and religious developments. That's overall the point. But it was complex. It was confusing. There were times there were alliances, and people would have fought various battles with one another, and maybe 20 years later they may have fought against one another. So it was a very confusing time, as I say. The Tudor conquest, and particularly Elizabethan plantations of Ulster, were, as I say, initially successful. They had dispatched the old Irish chieftains from their entitlement to their lands, and this is particularly in Ulster, and transferring the legal title to the English crown. I'd mentioned surrender and regrant. So the establishment of land ownership was now, in a sense, was held in the English crown. So these people who had for centuries owned their land and held their families held sway over these lands, really they had now held their lands at the pleasure of an English crown. The administration of the country became more and more vested in the holder of the crown's representative in Ireland, though. In other words, there were times when London wasn't keeping its eye very, very clearly on what was going on in Ireland, and appointed Lord Deputies and later became Viceroys. And these particular characters were themselves very powerful. They would have established parliaments, but that parliament was very much subservient to the London Parliament. But the Lord Deputy was capable of ensuring that bills were passed that were peculiar and specific to Ireland. But the situation became more and more intolerable for the Old English great families and those Gaelic lords that I've mentioned. And they were seeing themselves being really sidelined on the basis that they professed the wrong religion. The forces of Protestantism, it became more clearly a struggle between two specific entities, and that is Catholicism and Protestantism. It was about power. It wasn't so much about the intricacies of either religion in terms of theology so much, although there was an element of that. But it was really about power and identity. And the shared bitter experience of a continuing failure by Charles II particularly, who had made all sorts of promises on the basis that he was able to raise huge sums of money in Ireland for his own agenda. These were, you might remember, these were called the Graces, and these had been negotiated by a group of influential Irish, um, both merchants, etc., but people who were particularly interested in the the development of the people who professed Catholicism and who were pretty much the old Irish and the new and the old English. But these graces were going to be a major, I suppose, a major attempt to reverse some of the land confiscations, the penalties of major payments that they had had. There were a whole ream of various different things that the graces were to produce. But the promise was made, but kept being delayed. And the patience really of these two strands was really at this stage, these two strands of Irish society was beginning to get very, very taut, and the thread was very much becoming untangled. So it led this specific situation of frustration. It led to the possibility of an armed resistance, a resurgence, let's say, of striking against the powers that be. Not necessarily the crown, but the powers that be in Westminster. And they actually managed to bring together huge army. And in effect, we might have forgotten this, and I, to some extent, had forgotten it. They were so successful that they actually took over and took back 3/4 of the lands of Ireland at that time. They were very, very effective in what they did. This was, you might recall, those of you who've gone through secondary school education, you might remember the Confederation of Kilkenny. This is a mixture of the old Irish families, Gaelic, powerful, influential families who had their own followers. The old English had been Norman families who were exasperated as well and had seen their influence waning, and all of the disappointment that had taken place around promises not being kept. And also an alliance with Rome and a very powerful legate called Rinuccini, who was sent by Innocent II, I think, Pope Innocent II from Rome, to advise and bring monies and some materials from Italy to help this alliance. And it owed a lot of its success, primarily militarily, to some very good leadership, but also, more importantly, in a way, the fact that, England's problems were, in this situation, became Ireland's opportunity. And there had been civil war had broken out intermittently in England and Scotland over the legitimacy of the king's power to rule on the basis of divine right. We'll hear a little bit more of that. So this was the idea, the supremacy, the active supremacy that had been mentioned by Sandy earlier there. This idea that, the kings down through the centuries had always maintained that their power was absolute on the basis that they were divinely crowned, and that this continuation. But Parliament and the development of Parliament and representative of minorities, albeit people who could afford to be represented in Parliament, they began to really be jealous and very, very fearful of the absoluteness of the king's power. So these civil wars were breaking out in in England and in Scotland. So the Confederation, which was specifically a very Catholic one, and given that the vast majority of the people, as I say, were Catholic at that time, it could be described as that confederation as a national force, as it were. That's slightly, um, I suppose, in a way, we didn't speak so much of national politics as it were at that time. But the military success of the Confederation was deeply worrying to both the Crown, but also to the parliamentarians in England, particularly the parliamentarians who were of the puritanical persuasion and very, very strongly um, puritanical and devout in themselves of their religion. And we've spoken about that othering of Catholicism and Catholic position as being described as the beast, as being something that was evil. That those tensions, those belief systems had grown up among some of the more some of the more right wing, let's call it, Puritans in the Parliament, in the English Parliament. So while these various different attempts at taking back control over the lands of Ireland for a Catholic grouping, there had been, and without any question, there was some ferocity on the part of the armies that were regaining control over certain areas. And this particularly happened in Ulster. And there is no question, evidence is very, very clear about this. There were massacres of Protestant settlers, initially by some of the camp followers, but then laterally by some of the official army people who were under the control of the Confederation forces. All, as I say, there is a lot of evidence of that kind of level of massacre. This, not excusing it in any way, but this had been grown up because of the resentment, because these settlers had taken over lands that had previously belonged to people who then saw their opportunity of getting revenge, and there was some horrific scenes. But these horrific scenes were actually greatly exaggerated when the red tops, let's say, the way of knowledge being becoming known in England, the numbers of people that had been massacred from thousands to, I think there at one stage was a rumor of nearly 1 million Protestants being massacred by these people, these Catholics over in that barbarous place called Ireland. Now, there was by no stretch of the imagination a more than 50, 70, 80,000 Protestants on the whole island. So the idea of there being 1 million Protestants being massacred is slightly exaggerated. But these events were later seen as explanations for the ferocities and atrocities that were later to be committed by the parliamentary armies that were brought over at the command of Oliver Cromwell. The parliamentarians, just to remind you, they had come to the stage where they were confident enough to actually cause the execution of Charles I, and pretty much declared England a republic, as it were. There was no king. The most powerful person on the island at that stage was, in fact, Oliver Cromwell, who was a very devout Protestant. So he was also a very, very accomplished military person and had served very, very well in the Civil War in England. So this concern about what was happening over in Ireland, um, once they had dealt with the English king in fairly unceremonious way, they assembled a huge army. Um, I think the estimates were something in the region of, if I remember rightly, there were over 100 ships that had been brought together. And this was 1649, just to remind people where we're at. Um, and these ships were full of troops and equipment. So they landed actually in Ringsend. There had been an attempt to take over Dublin by the Confederation forces, and for various reasons, somebody blew the whistle or alerted the guardians in Dublin Castle, and there was a surprise routing of the Cromwellian forces that were stationed around Rathmines, for those who know the geography. So just in general terms, though, just again to remind you, the Cromwellian conquest or reconquest of Ireland was really highly efficient and was extremely effective. It was also very bloody, as we know and we remember and we hear the stories and the myths that are recounted that frighten little children, those stories. And it's lived on in the memories of the Irish people and diaspora to this day. I mean, there's no doubt about it. Those stories travelled across the Atlantic as well, and have had their effect on maybe some anti-English sentiment to some degree. But people will remember the very first town that was attacked by this impressive force, this modern army that was called the New Model Army of the Parliamentarians. They sacked, as the term is used, they sacked Drogheda, which was defended by a garrison of 3,000 men, a very significant garrison. But within a week, given its superior cannon and superior equipment, they breached the walls of Drogheda, and the Parliamentarians got straight into the town, a very significant town at that time, of Drogheda, and there was slaughter. There was slaughter of all the royalists, because the royalists had joined with the Confederation, and they slaughtered the Confederate men, as well as many civilians. It is said women and children as well. And that was carried out at the express orders of Oliver Cromwell. And as I say, his name is still whispered among today's townspeople. While it's said that negotiations were being carried out for the surrender of the port of Wexford, meanwhile, or a little bit later, these Roundheads broke into the town while negotiations were going on, and they slaughtered another 2,000 men, including many civilians. There were further defeats of the Confederate forces, and there was a loss of very important towns along the way. Followed that while in the north, they managed at one stage, I think it was only Enniskillen was the only part that was under the hands of the Irish. But by the time the Cromwellian forces had finished, the whole province was controlled by the Cromwellian forces. And before Cromwell actually left Ireland in 1652, the old landowning classes, both native, Irish and Old English families, had been mostly wiped out. And with that, the patronage of the Gaelic poets and bards suffered hugely. Now, I'm going to skip a little period of time, and I'm not going to go in. I'd love to be able to fill in all the bits and pieces, but you remember after this time, the very famous Battle of the Boyne, in which again the civil war in England, where the William of Orange was invited to oust King James from his throne in England. They fought that civil war on Irish lands. and the Battle of the Boyne became very celebrated. Um, so there was a major defeat, an attempt and a hope again that there would be some level of restoration of the position of the old Irish, and their position. But the Battle of the Boyne and its result, and later the surrendering, it's about a year later, the surrendering of Limerick by the Jacobite troops, who surrendered, those who were fought for James, and their Irish allies, against the Williamite forces. That too was a very significant watershed in Irish affairs. And again, I'd repeat that all hope of any restoration of Catholic rights and freedom to participate in the affairs of their country really diminished. And as part of the conditions of the surrender of Limerick, those of you will remember the famous Treaty of Limerick. And there were guarantees of religious freedom and the retention of lands of those Catholics who didn't actually join in the flight of the wild geese to France following the defeat and surrender of Limerick. And to be fair, I think William himself regretted deeply the reneging of the promises that were made at that time. The Parliament in England wouldn't agree to those promises of restoration of lands and religious freedom. So in effect, they were going to ensure that business as usual was going to take place. And the Gaelic cause of Ireland was again left totally bereft of significant leaders, particularly. But the government of Ireland was now more and more under the full control of a very small minority of Protestants, and there was an opportunity to ensure the continuation of this. The Irish Parliament, they saw their time had come to actually really have that moment of hegemony over these people, these Catholics, who they looked down on incredibly. These were later called the ascendancy, as it were, but they enacted several laws to suppress the practice of what is described as popery, and with the intention, without any question, a real agenda to impoverish the adherents of that religion. Now, there were penal laws as well in England, and they were very effective in some respects, but not as ferocious as they were experienced on this island. The more draconian and impactful laws that had that were enacted at that time, it brings me to that point about the influence of enactments and the effects on the spirit of a people. And maybe you might reflect on that. One of the things was that no child could be educated by a Catholic teacher. That deprived the vast majority of them of an education. We know that there were some strategies that were developed to get around this, but the intention was very, very clear. They were wanting to leave the population an ignorant population. No Catholic could own a horse worth more than, it said, five pounds in my day. But I've rounded it up to 60 euros now. But if somebody had a more valuable horse, a Protestant could tender 60 euros and enforce that sale. That seems like a fairly small thing, but it really was reflecting on the attack on property of any Catholic property owner. Catholic bishops and monks were to depart Ireland by a certain date, and if they were to return, they would be executed. Catholics were forbidden to enter the professions. Lawyers or doctors, they were not allowed to enter into any of the professions unless they were willing to denounce their religion. And of course, many people would not do that. There were all sorts of legal obligations for them to humiliate themselves in a way. A Catholic couldn't even serve on a jury. And if this is against property, if a Catholic eldest son were to convert to Protestantism, his father would become a mere tenant on the land and the son would become the owner. Tempting, maybe. If the sons were all Catholic, the land would be divided equally amongst them on the death of the father. Now, I think that's very, very significant, because that really had the effect of making all of the land holdings smaller and smaller and smaller. And we might see later on, not this evening, we might see later on the effects of that had down through a number of decades. Catholics weren't even allowed to vote or hold any public office. And remember also, Irish Presbyterians were also subjected to these laws. So this legislative sectarianism had an accumulating impact on the Irish Catholic population, and it would serve to create a peasant society that was often landless or living on a very small land parcels, poorly educated, having to find secret ways to practice their religion, and be devoid of all rights to participate in civil society, with their language and their customs and traditions being treated as inferior. Yeah, these were not the chosen people. I'll leave it there. Thank you.